Hello and welcome back to Family Revenge Secrets, the place where we unearth the most painful, soul-stirring stories of betrayal and redemption. If you've ever felt like an outcast in your own home or wondered how deep a parent's love can truly run, you're in the right place. We're about to dive into one of our most requested sagas, a tale that has resonated with millions. Be sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss a single chapter of what's to come. Now, let's begin. This is the Golden Child vs. the Scapegoat. The air in the house always felt thickest on a Sunday. It wasn't the dust motes dancing in the afternoon sunbeams that made it so, but the unspoken truths that hung heavy between the walls. It was the day of Alina's grand performance, a weekly ritual where she played the part of the perfect mother to one son and an attentive stranger to the other. There was Noah, the eldest, the golden child. He was born with a certain effortless ease, a charm that seemed to absorb all the love and light in the room, leaving nothing but shadow. His hair was a shade of sun-bleached blonde, his smile was quick, and his voice carried a natural authority that commanded attention. From the moment he entered a room, Alina's face would transform, her eyes crinkling at the corners as if she had just spotted a long-lost treasure. He was her monument, her masterpiece, a living testament to her own perceived success. And then there was Ethan, the younger brother, the scapegoat. He was the shade left over from Noah's light. His hair was a darker brown, his shoulders a little rounder, and his laugh was something he held onto, rarely letting it spill out in the presence of his family. For as long as he could remember, Ethan had lived in the negative space of their family portrait. Where Noah had a trophy for every sport, Ethan had a pile of second-place ribbons. Where Noah's triumphs were celebrated with fanfare, Ethan's were acknowledged with a nod, or more often, a sigh of relief. Sunday dinner was a tableau of this truth. The dining room table was set with heirloom china, the one Alina only used for special occasions, which in reality meant any occasion where Noah was the main event. Noah sat to Alina's right, basking in her undivided attention. She would spoon the best parts of the roast beef onto his plate, the marbled, tender slices, and then, without looking up, slide a smaller, drier portion onto Ethan's. "So, Noah," Alina would begin, her voice sweet as honey, "tell us again about that presentation you gave at the office. Mr. Henderson himself said it was the most brilliant he'd seen all year." Noah would launch into his story, detailing his sharp-witted answers and the applause he received. Alina's eyes would never leave his face, a private audience of one. The conversation, like the roast beef, was carved solely for him. Ethan, sitting across the table, would simply chew his food, an invisible figure at his own family's feast. He had his own story to tell. He'd just been awarded a grant for his photography project, a passion he poured his soul into, but he knew better than to interrupt the symphony of praise. He tried once years ago and had been met with a cold silence followed by, "That's nice, dear." "Now, Noah, what was that about your promotion?" The message was clear. His accomplishments were merely background noise to Noah's crescendo. This pattern wasn't limited to meals. It was woven into the very fabric of their lives. For Noah's birthday last year, Alina had thrown him a lavish party, a rented hall filled with friends and colleagues, and gifted him a sleek new car. The car was parked in the driveway, a shimmering testament to her devotion. This year, for Ethan's birthday, he had received a check tucked inside a generic card. The check was for a modest amount, and the card had no personal message. It simply read, "Happy birthday, Ethan." He wasn't foolish enough to be hurt by the lack of grandeur. He had learned to expect it, but the stark difference between the celebrations felt like a physical weight in his chest. A silent declaration that his existence was, at best, an afterthought. The most painful examples were in their failures. When Noah flunked his driver's test the first time, Eleanor had held him close, stroking his hair and whispering that it was just a small hiccup. "It's a tricky test," she'd said. "You're too smart for them to understand." She spent the next week helping him study, driving with him for hours. When Ethan failed a math test, he was grounded for a month. "You're a disappointment, Ethan," she'd said, her voice a sharp blade. "You have no excuse, look at your brother." Ethan had spent his entire life trying to prove that he was not a disappointment, that he was worthy of the same love, the same warmth, the same light. He worked harder, studied longer, and pushed himself to be better, all for a glance of approval from the woman who gave all her attention to someone else. He was a shadow trying to become a person, a ghost knocking on a door that would never open. He knew, deep down, that his pain was a secret he could never share. To admit that his mother didn't love him the same way she loved his brother would be an unforgivable betrayal in her eyes, another mistake to be held against him. So he wore a quiet smile and an empty heart, learning to exist in the cold, hard space where his mother's affection should have been. He was a living paradox, a part of this family, yet completely, utterly alone. He wore a smile like a borrowed suit, thin and ill-fitting. The calendar on his wall was marked with a red circle around the 14th, his birthday, but the mark felt like a target rather than a celebration. He had tried, in the quiet solitude of his room, to convince himself that this year would be different. That maybe, just maybe, the day would hold a sliver of the warmth that his brother received so effortlessly. It was a fragile hope, a stubborn weed pushing through the cracks of a long-neglected sidewalk. The morning came with the usual silence. The house was awake but not lively. He went downstairs, half expecting a chorus of happy birthday, and the sight of a small cake. Instead, Eleanor was already on the phone, her voice animated, laughing about something with a friend. She hung up and gestured to the kitchen counter. "Breakfast is on the table, Ethan. Your father left early for a meeting." Her words were a rote, perfunctory statement, the kind you'd give to a delivery man. No mention of the day, no glimmer of recognition in her eyes. He ate in silence, the eggs tasting like a mouthful of ash. After breakfast, he saw it, a small, wrapped package next to his usual stack of mail. His heart gave a little jump, a frantic bird against the bars of its cage. It was from Eleanor. He peeled back the paper to reveal a box of charcoal pencils and a blank sketchbook. "Found it on sale," as she said, not even turning from the sink. "Thought you could use it for whatever you do." He nodded, a thank you dying in his throat. The gift was practical, a gesture of obligation more than affection. It was a means to an end. It was the equivalent of a mother giving her son a shovel and saying, "Here, go dig a hole." It was what she would give to a stranger, not a son. He clutched the sketchbook, the untouched pages a stark reminder of the empty spaces in his life. The rest of the day unfolded in a slow, agonizing crawl. There was no cake, no dinner out, no family gathering. It was just another day. The phone rang only for Noah. Eleanor's voice, which had been so flat for him, would brighten instantly, a lamp switched on in a dark room. The final blow came that evening. As Ethan was reading in his room, he heard the front door open and a flurry of excited voices. He went downstairs to see Eleanor holding a large box, her face aglow with an almost childlike glee. "Look what came, honey," she exclaimed to Noah. Noah grinned, pulling the item from the box. It was a brand-new, top-of-the-line camera body. Not just any camera, but the one Ethan had been saving for all year, the one he had spent hours researching. The one that was a professional's tool, not a hobbyist's toy. "It's for your video content," Eleanor chirped. "Your dad and I saw you needed an upgrade. A true artist deserves the best tools, right?" Noah held the camera like a scepter, his golden aura almost visible in the dim hallway light. "This is incredible. Mom, thank you. This changes everything." The words were not meant to hurt Ethan, but they struck him harder than any direct insult could have. A true artist deserves the best tools. The words echoed in his mind, mocking him, taunting the sketchbook on his desk. He looked from the gleaming camera in Noah's hands to the charcoal pencils in his own. The disparity wasn't just about money or gifts. It was about worth. It was about potential. It was about belief. Eleanor believed in Noah's art, even if that art was a series of poorly edited vlogs about his daily life. She saw his potential, his brilliance, and was willing to invest in it. She saw nothing but a hobby in Ethan's photography, a distraction from his real, unremarkable life. She saw no artistry, no potential, no future. She saw a boy who needed to be given a gift because it was his birthday, and a man who deserved one because he existed. A quiet rage, cold and heavy, settled in Ethan's gut. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't an oversight. This was a pattern, a rule, a law of the universe that governed their family. He wasn't forgotten. He was remembered precisely for what he was, the one who was less. The one who wasn't worth the grand gesture. The one whose dreams were smaller, whose talents were lesser, and whose very existence was a quiet, inconvenient footnote. He turned and went back to his room, closing the door softly behind him. The sound of Eleanor's joyful voice and Noah's excited laughter faded into a low hum. He sat on his bed and looked at the sketchbook, at the blank pages waiting to be filled. They felt like a mirror now, reflecting a future where he was a ghost in his own life, a shadow in the light cast by others. The hope that had bloomed so briefly in his heart shriveled and died. It was replaced by something cold and hard, the solid, undeniable knowledge that he was truly, irrevocably, alone. The days that followed were filled with a brittle quiet. Ethan carried the weight of his birthday like a shroud, feeling the cold indifference of his family with every breath. He stayed in his room, the new sketchbook lying untouched on his desk, a constant reminder of a love that was given to another. He could hear Noah downstairs, his laughter ringing out, his voice full of the carefree joy that Ethan had never known. It was the sound of a life lived without consequence, a life blessed by a mother's unending favor. The silence was broken on a Tuesday afternoon. It was the sound of something shattering, a sharp, violent crash that echoed through the house. It wasn't a human sound, but the sound of something breaking under pressure. Ethan went downstairs, a sense of foreboding settling over him. He found Noah standing in the middle of the living room, eyes wide with panic. On the polished hardwood floor, scattered in 100 tiny, irreparable pieces, lay Eleanor's favorite antique vase. It was a gift from her mother, an ornate porcelain piece that had sat on the mantel for as long as Ethan could remember, a delicate symbol of their family's fragile harmony. Next to the shattered fragments, a video game controller lay on the ground, dropped in a moment of frenzied, panicked carelessness. "It wasn't me," Noah stammered, his face a mask of feigned terror. He looked at the wreckage, then at Ethan, and in that split second, a cold calculation crossed his features. "Ethan, what did you do?" The words hit Ethan like a physical blow. He didn't even have to look at the controller to know what had happened. He had watched this scene play out 100 times over the years. Noah made a mistake, and Ethan paid for it. It was the script they lived by. The sound of the crash brought Eleanor running from the kitchen, her face tight with concern. Her eyes scanned the room, from the broken porcelain to the controller, and finally landed on Noah's tearful, contrite expression. He looked like a wounded angel, his eyes welling up as he pointed a trembling finger at his brother. "Mom," Noah sobbed, his voice choked with emotion, "I was just playing and I saw Ethan. He was running and he hit the table. I tried to catch it, but I couldn't." Eleanor's face, which had been so full of sympathy for Noah, hardened as she turned to Ethan. Her eyes were not searching for the truth. They were searching for the confirmation of a lie she already believed. "Ethan," she said, her voice a low, chilling whisper. "What did you do?" Ethan stood there, utterly still. He could feel the cold tile floor beneath his feet, the quiet hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. He wanted to shout, to scream, to point at the controller and the evidence that was scattered right there on the floor. But he had learned that the truth was a fragile thing in this house, easily shattered by a mother's prejudice. "Mom, I didn't," he said, his voice calm, which he knew would be held against him. Noah was playing and he dropped his controller. It hit the side table and the vase fell. Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't even look at the controller. She just stared at him, her gaze a mixture of disappointment and disgust. "I don't believe you, Ethan," she said, her voice filled with a finality that felt like a verdict. "Look at your brother. He's heartbroken. You stand there so calm, so cold. It's a miracle you show any emotion at all." "But Mom," Ethan pleaded, his voice cracking with the injustice of it all. "He's lying. I was on the other side of the room. I didn't even touch the table. Look at the controller. It's his." Noah's face twisted in an expression of wounded innocence. "How could you say that, Ethan? I was just trying to help you. I can't believe you would lie." Eleanor knelt and put her arms around Noah, stroking his hair, pulling him close. "It's okay, baby," she murmured. "I know you didn't do it. I know you'd never lie to me." The scene played out in a silent movie behind Ethan's eyes. The golden child was forgiven, absolved before the crime was even investigated. The scapegoat was condemned not for his actions, but for his very nature. This was it. This wasn't about a broken vase. It was about a broken lie. The fundamental lie of their family, the lie that truth mattered, that love was earned, that a mother could be fair. Ethan felt something inside him finally give way. The last thread of his fragile hope snapped. He was not a son to be loved, he was a character to be played. The role of the villain, the one who was always wrong, the one who was always to blame. The truth was just a small, insignificant thing, a whisper that could never drown out the roar of Eleanor's belief in her golden son. He turned and walked away. There was no argument left to be made, no evidence left to present. The trial was over before it began. He went up to his room, and for the first time in his life, he didn't cry. He didn't feel angry. He felt nothing but a cold, hard, terrifying clarity. The family he had spent his life trying to belong to was nothing but a mirage. It was a story told for the benefit of one person, a story in which he was nothing more than the shadow. He had spent his entire life trying to earn a place at a table that was never meant for him. He had fought battles he could never win, all for the fleeting hope of a mother's approval. Now, in the quiet solitude of his room, the truth he had so recently discovered sat with him like an uninvited guest. The lie was so deeply ingrained in the family's DNA that it was the only reality they knew. It was a story with a hero and a villain, and the roles were never up for negotiation. The clarity was a cold thing, but it was also liberating. He no longer had to chase after a love that didn't exist. He no longer had to defend himself against accusations that had no basis in reality. The game was over. He wasn't playing anymore. His decision was not a sudden burst of anger. It was a slow, methodical conclusion, like a mathematician arriving at the final, irrefutable number. Ethan knew what he had to do. He would leave, not in a fit of rage, but in a quiet, deliberate act of self-preservation. He saved every penny from his part-time job at the local library, a small fortress of cash accumulating in a tin box under his bed. He researched small apartments and planned his exit as if it were a military operation. He told no one. There was no point. They would only twist his departure into another act of selfishness. The day came on a Saturday, a day that should have been filled with the ordinary motions of a family's weekend. Eleanor was in the kitchen, scrolling through a magazine, while Noah was in his room, the sounds of his video game music thumping through the floorboards. Ethan carried his packed duffel bag downstairs. It was the only bag he owned, containing all his worldly possessions, a few clothes, his sketchbook, and his treasured camera. He stood in the hallway, the worn carpet a memory beneath his feet, and looked at his mother. She didn't look up from her magazine. "Mom," he said, his voice steady. "I'm leaving." Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with what he now recognized as not surprise but shock. Her carefully constructed world, the one where he was always available to be the villain, was being dismantled before her very eyes. "Leaving?" she repeated, her voice a fragile whisper. "What are you talking about?" "I've found a small apartment downtown," he said calmly. "I'm moving out." The magazine fell from her hands, clattering to the floor. "You can't do this, Ethan. You can't just leave. Your father and I have provided for you. What about your future? What about us?" The fear in her voice was not for him, but for her own image. How would she explain this to her friends? What would people think? Her precious golden family was losing a piece, and it was his fault. Noah, drawn by the commotion, appeared at the top of the stairs, his face a mixture of confusion and annoyance. "What's going on?" he grumbled. Elena turned to him, her eyes pleading. "Noah, your brother says he's leaving." Just like that, Noah's expression shifted. The annoyance was replaced by a look of genuine concern, but it was a selfish concern. Without Ethan, who would she pick on? Who would he be able to blame his mistakes on? "Ethan, what are you doing?" he said, his voice laced with an unfamiliar tension. "Don't be dramatic. Just tell Mom you're sorry and come back to your senses." "There's nothing to apologize for," Ethan said, meeting his brother's gaze without flinching for the first time in his life. "I'm just going to start my own life." Elena rose from her chair, her face a mask of wounded betrayal. "This is what you do, Ethan. You always make things so difficult. You're just like your father's side of the family, selfish and ungrateful." Her voice rose with each word, a crescendo of manipulation. "After everything we've done for you, you walk away without a word of thanks. You're trying to hurt us, aren't you?" Ethan looked from his mother's theatrics to his brother's panicked face. He didn't try to explain. There was no point. The truth had no currency here. He simply picked up his bag and walked towards the door. The sound of Elena's furious sobs followed him. He didn't turn back. He knew that the sobs were not for him, but for the unraveling of her perfect lie. The cold air hit him as he stepped outside. It was a shock, a sudden, exhilarating baptism. He looked back at the house, a grand, imposing structure that now seemed small and suffocating. The windows were black eyes staring back at him. He didn't feel sad. He felt a profound, bone-deep relief. He was no longer a shadow in their light. He was his own light, however dim. His new apartment was a single room with a small kitchenette and a window that looked out onto a brick wall. It was nothing like the house he had left, but it was his. The walls were bare, the silence was absolute, and for the first time, he felt safe. The solitude was not a burden, it was a sanctuary. He ate his meals in peace, read books without interruption, and worked on his photography late into the night. He was poor, yes, but he was free. He was the master of his own loneliness. Meanwhile, back at the house, a different kind of silence had fallen. Elena and Noah were left alone, two people who had relied on a third to bear their burdens. The vacuum of his absence was palpable. They no longer had a scapegoat, and with nowhere else to direct their anger, they began to turn on each other. Noah's mistakes, once so easily blamed on his brother, were now laid bare. Elena's perfect monument was cracking, and for the first time, she had no one to point at but the child she had so meticulously sculpted. The lie was still there, but it was getting harder to believe. The stage was set, and the two remaining actors were now forced to face a drama they had never had to perform. Ethan found that the hardest part of freedom wasn't the lack of money or the isolation. It was the sheer, suffocating silence. In his new one-room apartment, there were no footsteps on the stairs, no slam of a door, no passive-aggressive sighs from a mother, no self-congratulatory laughter from a brother. The silence was his to own, and it was as vast and empty as the ocean. He'd lived his life surrounded by noise, a constant symphony of other people's needs and opinions. Now, in the stillness, he finally had room to hear his own thoughts. He began to rebuild piece by painful piece. His days were a rhythmic cycle: work at the library in the mornings, where the quiet order of the books was a soothing balm to his frayed nerves, a simple, inexpensive meal in the evening, and then, in the late hours of the night, he would pull out his camera. The small apartment with its single window became his studio. He took photos of the mundane: the way the streetlight hit the brick wall across the alley, the dust motes dancing in the slivers of sun that cut through his blinds, the slow decay of a fallen leaf he had found on the street. These weren't grand photos of nature or people, but they were his, a visual diary of a life finally lived on his own terms. The loneliness was a different beast from the one he had known at home. At Aliner's house, he was surrounded by people and yet was profoundly alone, a ghost in the family's picture. Here, he was physically alone, but the quiet emptiness was clean, free of the toxic energy that had consumed him. It was a loneliness that could be tended to, a wound that could begin to heal. But a wound cannot heal without a scab, and that scab came in the form of a phone call. It was a Saturday night, 3 weeks after he'd left. His phone rang, the sound a jarring intrusion in the quiet of his apartment. The name on the screen was Aliner. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the decline button. He had to remind himself that she wasn't calling out of love or concern. She was calling because something had gone wrong and she needed someone to blame. He took a deep breath and answered. "Ethan? Ethan, thank God." Her voice was a whirlwind of manufactured emotion. "Why haven't you called? Your father and I have been so worried sick. This is so selfish of you." He let the words hang in the air, a familiar song he no longer felt like dancing to. "I'm fine, Mom. I'm doing well." "Doing well?" she shrieked. "Do you think you're doing well living in that hovel? Your brother found it for me on Google Maps. How could you put me through this?" He had been right. She wasn't calling for him. She was calling because her narrative had been disrupted. The perfect mother had a son living in a tiny apartment and she couldn't control the story. "Mom, I have to go," he said, his voice flat. He was not a son in this moment. He was a character trying to exit a play. "Wait," she cried. "It's Noah. Something is terribly wrong with him. He's been so moody since you left. He's been uncooperative. He just broke a window and said it was his fault. Can you believe it? The therapist says he's struggling with his feelings about your departure. You need to come home, Ethan. You need to fix this." A small, bitter laugh escaped Ethan's lips, so that was it. The human shield was gone. The golden child, stripped of his scapegoat, was finally having to face himself. "Mom," he said, "I can't fix this. This is something he has to deal with. It's not my fault he's struggling." "How can you be so cold?" she wailed. "You're ruining this family. You're tearing us apart. If you just came back, things would go back to the way they were. He needs you." "He needs you." The words twisted in Ethan's gut. Noah didn't need him. Noah needed a victim. The family didn't need him. They needed a punching bag. He hung up the phone. The sudden silence was a blessing, a return to the peaceful solitude he had begun to cherish. He knew their world was unraveling without him. Noah's unscrutinized life was now under a microscope. His petty failures and his entitled demeanor, once so easily brushed aside, were now the focus of Aliner's frustration. She no longer had a shadow to blame, and in her desperation, she was forced to confront the imperfect reality of her golden son. The cracks were starting to show, not only in her carefully constructed family, but in the foundation of her own sanity. For Ethan, the call was a final test, a last attempt by the family to pull him back into their dysfunction. He had passed. He was no longer a puppet on their strings. He was a person, alone in his room but finally free. The loneliness wasn't a punishment. It was the price of his independence, and he was finally ready to pay it. Eleanor's phone calls became a regular, toxic intrusion. The number of her calls mirrored the increasing chaos at the house. First, a few times a week, then daily, each one a desperate attempt to drag him back into the drama. She would recount Noah's latest failures, from a missed deadline at work to a petty argument with a friend. She would whisper, sometimes with a feigned sadness, "He just isn't the same since you left, Ethan. He's lost. He needs his brother." It was a lie so transparent it almost felt insulting. Ethan had learned to filter her words, to hear the subtext. He wasn't listening to a mother's plea for her son's return. He was listening to a queen who had lost her pawn and now faced a checkmate. The quiet peace of his apartment was his new fortress, and the decline button on his phone was the portcullis. He rarely answered, and when he did, his responses were short, emotionless, and devoid of the guilt she so desperately wanted him to feel. He was beginning to build a life, a quiet, simple life free from the suffocating pressure of being the family's punching bag. He had joined a local photography club, a small group of artists who met in a converted warehouse to share their work. Here, his talent wasn't just tolerated, it was celebrated. They saw the world through his lens, the raw emotion in his portraits, the stark beauty in his still life compositions. He was Ethan, the photographer, not Ethan, the scapegoat. The affirmation so long denied was a powerful healing force, but a wound cannot fully heal if the source of the injury remains. And so the inevitable happened. The email was short and impersonal, sent by his father, a man who had always been a silent accomplice in Eleanor's reign. "Family dinner. This Saturday. Your mother insists. It's important." The message was a command, not an invitation. A summons. Ethan considered ignoring it. He could simply delete the email and continue with his quiet, peaceful life. But a part of him, a foolish, masochistic part, wanted to see it with his own eyes. He wanted to witness the unraveling firsthand, to confirm that his freedom was not just a fantasy. He replied with a single word, "Okay." He arrived on Saturday evening, a lifetime feeling like it had passed in the short drive from his apartment. The house looked the same, but it felt different. The air was thick with a new kind of tension, not just the passive-aggressive silence he remembered, but an active, simmering resentment. He found his mother and Noah in the living room, a silent tableau of two people who no longer knew how to exist without a third party to mediate their dysfunction. Eleanor was tense, her smile a brittle thing. Noah looked at him with a strange mix of relief and accusation. "So you decided to show up," Noah said, his voice laced with an edge Ethan had never heard before. "Must be nice, doing whatever you want." "It is," Ethan replied simply, his own calm demeanor a shield against the familiar hostility. Dinner was a train wreck. The conversation, once a monologue dedicated to Noah's achievements, was now a series of awkward pauses and thinly veiled insults. Eleanor tried to steer the conversation back to their usual topics, praising Noah for a small project he'd just completed. But Noah, unaccustomed to the pressure, was no longer a golden boy. "It was nothing, Mom," he snapped. "A kid could have done it." Eleanor's face fell, a look of betrayal flashing in her eyes. The final straw came when Eleanor brought up a photo album filled with old pictures from their childhood. She flipped through the pages, pointing out Noah's trophies, his awards, his beaming smile. "Remember how happy we were?" she said, her voice dripping with nostalgia. Everything was so simple. She passed the album to Ethan, her eyes silently daring him to challenge her narrative. He looked at the pictures, at the smiling faces of a family that never existed. He found a photo of himself, maybe 12 years old, holding a ribbon he'd won at a school fair. It was a proud moment, but in the picture, he was alone, standing off to the side, a ghost at his own celebration. He looked up from the album, his eyes meeting his mother's. "It was never simple, Mom," he said, his voice low and clear. It was only simple for him. He pointed at the picture of Noah. Because he was the only one who mattered. The air in the room went cold. Eleanor's face, a mask of forced happiness, shattered. "How can you say that?" she shrieked, her control finally giving way. "I gave you everything. I loved you both equally." "You didn't," Ethan said, the words a calm, irrefutable truth. "You loved him, and you tolerated me. You praised him when he won, and you blamed me when he failed. Even when he was the one who broke the vase, you looked me in the eyes and lied." Eleanor rose from her chair, her face a mask of rage. "Get out!" she screamed, pointing a trembling finger at the door. "Get out of my house, you ungrateful child. We have no room for liars here." Ethan looked at his brother, who sat frozen in his seat, his mouth agape. He looked at his mother, her face red and distorted with fury. And in that moment, he felt a profound sense of peace. He had finally said what needed to be said. He had exposed the lie. He walked towards the door, not with a sense of defeat, but with a sense of victory. He was leaving again, but this time he was leaving with his head held high. The door closed behind him, a final, definitive sound, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with the quiet, triumphant roar of his own truth. The drive back to his apartment was a blur of streetlights and silent reflection. The words he had spoken echoed in his mind, each one a stone thrown into the still water of his family's self-deception. For the first time, he hadn't just been the scapegoat, he had been the truth-teller. He had shattered the illusion, not for them, but for himself. The raw fury in his mother's eyes was proof that he had finally hit the mark. Her rage wasn't a sign of his failure, it was a testament to his success. He had exposed the core of their dysfunction, and in doing so, he had truly set himself free. For weeks, the silence was absolute. No calls, no texts, no emails. The silence was a bomb, a quiet affirmation that the final thread had been severed. He focused on his work, on his photography, on the small, simple joys of a life built on his own terms. He was no longer trying to prove his worth. He was living it. He discovered the profound satisfaction of being enough for himself. Then the quiet was broken. The phone rang, and the name on the screen was Eleanor. He almost declined, but a flicker of something new, not hope, but curiosity, made him answer. "Ethan?" Her voice was soft, hesitant, a tone he had never heard before. All the bluster and fury were gone. "Ethan, it's Mom." "I know," he said, his voice flat. I've been thinking," she began, her words slow and deliberate. "And I want to apologize. I know I said some things. I was upset. I didn't mean them." He remained silent, letting her words hang in the air. He had heard her apologies before. They were always a precursor to a new demand, a new manipulation. "I was wrong about the vase," she continued, her voice gaining a touch of false sincerity. "Noah, well, he admitted it was his fault. He's been very emotional lately. He said he was just worried about me and didn't want me to get mad. You understand, don't you? He's always been so sensitive." The familiar script. The lies were still the same, only the delivery had changed. It was no longer a furious demand, it was a soft plea. She wasn't asking for forgiveness, she was offering a new deal. "I'm not a child anymore, Mom," Ethan said calmly. "I don't need your apology, you can keep it. But I want you to come home," as she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "We miss you. The house feels so empty without you. Things just aren't right. We need to go back to the way we were." This was it, the real reason for the call. It wasn't about an apology, it was about restoration. She wanted to rewind the tape to a time when her life was simple, when she had a convenient emotional punching bag to deflect her own issues. "You want to go back to the way things were?" Ethan asked, a note of dark amusement in his voice. "So Noah gets to be the golden child, and I get to be the one who's always wrong? I get to live in your shadow so he can stand in your light?" A beat of silence. He had called her out directly, something he had never done before. "Of course not," she said, a brittle edge returning to her voice. "I want us to be a family again, a happy family. It's hard for Noah, you know. He's had to grow up. It would be easier for him if you were here. We can try to make things right. I promise I'll be better." "What about my life, Mom?" he asked. "What about my work? What about my peace?" "We can make it work," she insisted, the desperation seeping through. "You can still live your life, of course. We'll just be a family again. You can stay in your old room. We'll have dinner on Sundays. It will be just like before. It will be so much better." The silence on his end was his answer. She was offering him the same cage, only this time she had put a new coat of paint on the bars. She wanted him to return not out of love, but out of convenience. She wanted him back not as a son, but as a supporting character in her life story. "I can't," Ethan said, his voice firm and final. "I can't go back to the way it was. You're not offering me a family. You're offering me a role, and I'm done playing it." He hung up the phone. The quiet returned, but this time it was different. It was no longer a hesitant peace. It was a profound, unshakable serenity. He had not only left the house, he had finally left the lie. The quiet that followed the phone call was heavier than before. It wasn't the hollow silence of an empty room, but the pregnant pause before a storm. Ethan knew the offer to go back to the way it was their last desperate attempt. He had rejected it, and in doing so, he had sealed his fate. There would be no more fake apologies, no more desperate pleas. The game was over. He was no longer a pawn. He was an empty space on the board they couldn't fill. He spent the next few months in a state of quiet, unshakable peace. He immersed himself in his work, both at the library and in his photography. His portfolio grew, not with forced commercial shots, but with raw, honest images that captured the subtle beauty of ordinary life. He was starting to find his voice, both as an artist and as a person. The validation he found in his photography club was a powerful substitute for the love he had craved his whole life. They saw him not as a reflection of someone else's failures, but as the man he truly was. But a toxic family is like a shadow. It always finds a way to creep back in. And this time, it came not in the form of a plea, but of an ultimatum. The envelope was thick, heavy, and formal. It wasn't a birthday card or a Christmas letter. It was an official-looking document with a law firm's name printed on the top. Ethan's heart sank with a cold certainty. He didn't even have to open it to know what it was. It was a summons. He laid the document on his small kitchen table, the words "summons" and "complaint" bolded in an angry font. The letter outlined a legal complaint filed against him by Noah. The complaint was filled with a familiar litany of lies, but this time they were twisted into legal accusations. Noah was suing him for a share of a family inheritance, a fictional trust fund he claimed Ethan had conspired to take away from him. It was a baseless, absurd fabrication, but the language of the law made it sound real, serious, and threatening. The lie was no longer just a private family matter. It was now a public declaration, a performance in a court of law. Noah had a witness list. His mother's name was at the top. Ethan felt a surge of cold fury. They weren't content to simply have him gone. They had to destroy him. They had to prove to the world that he was exactly what they always said he was. A selfish, conniving, ungrateful person. He was no longer just a scapegoat. He was a villain in a public drama, and they were the righteous victims. He called the lawyer whose name was on the document. The secretary, a cold and impersonal voice, confirmed the lawsuit. "Mr. Noah Thompson is seeking restitution for damages and emotional distress," she said. It was a sick joke. The emotional distress was all his. The damages were all theirs. He found a good, but expensive, lawyer through a referral from his photography club. The lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named MS Davies, listened to his story with a calm, professional demeanor. "They have no case, Mr. Thompson," she said. "This is a harassment lawsuit, plain and simple. They are trying to force you back into their lives, or at the very least, make your life so miserable you'll wish you had never left. But I have to go to court." Ethan asked, the dread a heavy weight in his chest. "I have to face them." "Yes," she said, "you have to face them, and you have to tell the truth. But this time, the truth has a witness, me, and a judge and a court of record." The day of the court appearance arrived, a cold, gray morning that felt fitting for the occasion. The courtroom was sterile and uninviting, a stage where truth and lies would be put on trial. He saw them immediately, sitting on the opposite side of the courtroom. Eleanor was impeccably dressed, her face a mask of weary, long-suffering nobility. Noah sat beside her, his expression a mixture of feigned sadness and smug triumph. He was the hero of this story, and he knew it. Eleanor caught his eye and gave him a look, not of anger, but of sad disappointment, as if to say, "Look what you've forced us to do." It was a final, desperate manipulation. When it was his turn to take the stand, he felt a strange sense of calm. The lies had been a part of his life for so long that he was no longer afraid of them. The truth was his sword, and he was finally ready to wield it. He looked at the judge, at his lawyer, and at the faces of the people who had spent his entire life trying to make him small. And in that moment, he knew what he had to do. He would tell the whole story, every single painful, honest detail. The forgotten birthday, the broken vase, the constant blame, the fake apology, the phone call. This was not just about the lawsuit anymore. This was his final act of defiance. This was his truth. I'll continue writing Chapter 9 for you, picking up right after Ethan takes the stand. The courtroom, with its dark wood paneling and hushed tones, felt like a confessional booth. But this wasn't about seeking forgiveness. It was about laying bare a truth that had been hidden for a lifetime. When MS Davies, his lawyer, asked him to state his full name, a strange sense of calm washed over Ethan. He wasn't a scared child anymore. He was a man standing in his own light. "Ethan Thompson," he said, his voice clear and steady, a sound that seemed to surprise Eleanor and Noah sitting across the room. The questions began. MS Davies walked him through the events that had led to this moment. She asked about the birthday gifts, the forgotten celebrations, the report cards. Each memory, a stone he had carried for years, was now being placed on the scales of justice. He spoke of the sketchbook and the cheap pencils, and how, on that very same day, Noah had received a professional camera. He described the incident with the broken vase, recalling how his mother had believed Noah's lie without a second thought. "Did you break the vase, Mr. Thompson?" MS Davies asked. "No," Ethan replied, looking directly at the judge. "I didn't." He could feel their eyes on him, Eleanor's filled with a cold, desperate anger, Noah's with a panicked resentment. Their carefully constructed narrative was crumbling, piece by piece, under the weight of his quiet, undeniable testimony. The cross-examination was next. Noah's lawyer, a slick-haired man with a condescending smile, approached the stand. He tried to tear Ethan's story apart, to paint him as a bitter, resentful son trying to extort money from his loving family. "Mr. Thompson," the lawyer began, "you claim your mother has always favored your brother. Isn't it true that she sent you to a summer camp you enjoyed? Isn't it true she bought you a computer for college?" "She did," Ethan answered. "But my brother was given a brand new car to go to college. A computer is a tool. A car is an investment in freedom." The lawyer scoffed. "You seem to hold a lot of animosity towards your family. Isn't this whole lawsuit just a way to get back at them for your own personal failures?" This was the core of their lie. They couldn't accept their own wrongdoing, so they blamed him for his failures. But Ethan was no longer playing that game. "My failures are my own," Ethan said, his voice unwavering. "And so are my successes. The lawsuit isn't about me getting back at them. It's about them trying to pull me back into a life of lies and manipulation. I left because I didn't want to be their scapegoat anymore. They're suing me because they can't bear the thought of me being happy without them." A gasp came from the gallery, and the judge had to bang his gavel to restore order. The truth, in a public forum, had a power they could not contain. Noah was called to the stand next. He sat there, a golden boy no longer, but a man exposed. His lawyer tried to guide him to get him to stick to the script. But when faced with the cold, hard facts, Ethan's simple, honest account of their shared life, Noah's carefully constructed facade began to crack. He fumbled his answers, stuttered, and avoided eye contact with everyone in the room. He was a liar, and for the first time in his life, everyone could see it. The judge called a recess. As Ethan left the witness stand, he saw Eleanor and Noah huddle with their lawyer. Eleanor's face was pale, her hands shaking. She looked at Ethan, not with rage this time, but with a vacant, shattered expression. It was the look of a person who has just realized they've lost everything. The illusion of her perfect family, her golden boy, and her own flawless motherhood had been shattered in a few hours of testimony. Later that day, MS Davies received a call. Eleanor and Noah were withdrawing the lawsuit. They wouldn't be paying the legal fees. The case was dismissed. The lie had been defeated. Ethan walked out of the courthouse and into the afternoon sun. He wasn't a winner in a lawsuit. He was a survivor of a long and brutal war. The victory wasn't in the legal outcome, it was in the profound sense of peace he felt. He had stood up for himself, and the truth had set him free. The family he had so desperately tried to belong to was gone, but in its place, a new life had just begun. The lawsuit was over, but the echo of the gavel still resonated in Ethan's life. The dismissal of the case was not a joyous victory. It was a quiet, solemn marker of a final death. The family he had once known, the one he had spent his life trying to belong to, was now a ghost. They had made their final, desperate move, and they had failed. For weeks, he heard nothing from them. The silence was a profound, almost sacred thing. He was no longer a character in their drama. He was a free man, a narrator of his own story. He spent his days at the library, surrounded by the peaceful weight of stories bound in leather and paper. He spent his nights in his small apartment, the space he now considered a true sanctuary, working on his photography. He had a show coming up at a small local gallery, a collection of his urban landscapes. The photos were filled with a melancholic beauty, capturing the quiet moments in a bustling city. He had found his voice not in shouting but in whispering. Then, one evening, his phone rang. The name on the screen was not Eleanor or Noah. It was his father, a man who had always been a silent, compliant background figure in the family's drama. Ethan had not spoken to him since he left. He answered, a strange mix of dread and curiosity settling in his stomach. "Ethan," his father's voice was hoarse, unfamiliar. "It's me. I have to tell you something." Ethan's heart pounded with a cold fear. "What is it, Dad?" "It's your mother," he said, his voice cracking. "She's not doing well, not since the court thing." Ethan's mind immediately went to a place of physical illness, but his father quickly corrected him. "No, she's not sick. It's her mind. She's been withdrawn, quiet. She wanders around the house, looking at old photo albums. She keeps saying she can't remember when she was happy. She says she wishes she had done things differently." The words hit Ethan with the force of an emotional avalanche. This was it. The moment he had spent his entire life waiting for. A moment of recognition, a flicker of regret. But it came not from his mother's lips, but from his father's. And it was tainted with the bitterness of a truth discovered too late. "She keeps talking about you, Ethan," his father continued, his voice filled with a weary sorrow. "She went into your old room a few days ago. She found a photo you left behind, a picture of you and Noah when you were kids. You were so happy then." She looked at it for hours. She said she couldn't remember why things changed. "She keeps asking me if she made a mistake. I don't know what to tell her." Ethan listened in silence, his mind a whirlwind of old memories. The photos of a happy, perfect family that never existed. The constant favoritism. The unending lies. The pain had been so real, so tangible. And now, at the end of it all, his mother was left with nothing but a broken narrative and a shattered sense of self. "I didn't know how bad it was, son," his father said, the confession a quiet, painful admission. I went along with her. I always thought you kids would work it out. I just wanted to keep the peace. I never saw what she was doing. Or maybe I did, and I was just too much of a coward to say anything." The honesty was stunning. His father, the man who had always been a silent accomplice, was now confessing. It was a moment of profound, soul-stirring truth, but it was also a moment of profound, soul-stirring grief. The admission was too little, too late. The damage had been done. "Is she asking to see me?" Ethan asked, his voice raw. "No," his father said, the word a heavy sigh. "She can't bring herself to. She just sits there. She's lost. She's lost her golden boy, too. Noah's not the same. He's angry all the time. He can't get what he wants. He's starting to see that her love was conditional. She was feeding him a lie, too, a different kind of lie, and now he's seeing the strings." The tragedy of it all was overwhelming. Eleanor's carefully constructed world had crumbled, and in its wake, she was left with nothing. The son she had neglected was gone, and the son she had so blindly adored was now filled with a bitter resentment. She had not only lost her scapegoat, she had also lost her golden child. The truth, once so easily dismissed, had become her prison. Eleanor's late-stage recognition was a tragic footnote, a final, hollow validation that offered no comfort. Ethan didn't go to her. He couldn't. The woman his father described was a stranger, a broken version of the person who had caused him so much pain. The truth was, she hadn't found the mother in herself. She had only found the failure, and that was a burden he was no longer willing to carry. He had to mourn the mother he never had, and he had to let her go. His father's call was the last tether. Once the conversation ended, Ethan felt the finality of it all. He was truly, completely on his own. The silence was now not just peaceful, but liberating. It was the sound of a story reaching its natural conclusion. In the months that followed, his life blossomed in a way he never thought possible. His photo exhibition was a small success, a triumph that belonged entirely to him. He sold a few pieces, and more importantly, received genuine praise from people who saw his art, not his history. The gallery owner offered him a larger show, and a local magazine commissioned him to do a series of portraits. He was no longer just a photographer, he was an artist. His talent, once an invisible thing, was now a tangible, respected part of his identity. He found friendship, too, in the most unexpected of places. He met a woman named Sarah at a coffee shop he frequented. She was an illustrator, and they bonded over their shared love for quiet observation and the beauty of the mundane. She saw the world through colors and lines, and he saw it through light and shadow. They understood each other's unspoken language. Sarah's family was the opposite of his, warm, noisy, and openly affectionate. He saw what a functional family looked like, not in a perfect, manufactured way, but in a real, messy, and loving way. He was no longer looking for a replacement family. He was building a new one conversation, one shared meal at a time. One evening, Sarah asked him about his family. She had heard him talk about his childhood in general terms, but she had never heard the whole story. He felt a moment of hesitation, the ingrained fear of exposure still lingering. But he looked at her kind eyes and open heart, and he knew he could tell her the truth. He told her everything: the golden child, the scapegoat, the invisible boy, the broken vase, the lawsuit. He didn't speak with bitterness or anger, but with a quiet, reflective honesty. He was simply telling a story that happened to him, a tale of a boy who had to lose his family to find himself. When he finished, Sarah didn't say anything for a long time. She just took his hand, her touch gentle and reassuring. "That's not your story anymore, Ethan," she said softly. "You're not that boy. You're the man who walked away from all of that to build this beautiful life. You're the hero of your own story." Her words were a final, cleansing rain. For so long, he had been defined by what he wasn't, not the golden child, not loved, not valued. But Sarah's words reframed it all. He was defined by what he was: a survivor, an artist, a man who had the courage to choose his own peace. He had spent his life waiting for someone else to see his worth. Now he was finally a man who saw it for himself. He never spoke to his family again. He had no desire to. The book was closed, the final chapter written. He had learned that true love couldn't be earned or demanded. It had to be given freely, a gift. And the greatest gift he had ever received was the one he had given himself: the gift of freedom. The story of the golden child and the scapegoat wasn't a tragedy. It was a testament. A testament to the power of a single person's will to survive and thrive. A testament to the truth that no one can choose the family they are born into, but everyone can choose the life they build. And in the end, that was a story worth telling. Thank you all for listening to this story. Every story is a mirror, reflecting the broken pieces and the light of life. I hope that through Ethan's journey, you have found the strength to value yourselves, protect your self-worth, and have the courage to walk your own path. Always cherish unconditional love and hold on to your family's happiness. I wish you and your family good health, peace, and happiness. See you in the next stories.